The Starfield Direct opens the radio transmission with some static in the background. In this, we hear how Constellation Star Station is getting a transmission from Starship Frontier, which jumps into the commencing countdown for their jump. Funny enough, this is immediately a bunch of lore around Starfield. What's actually happening here is us, as Starship Frontier, is contacting one of the main star stations of our faction, that with Constellation, the major faction we join in Starfield. During this follow-up countdown sequence, what we're actually seeing here is a lot of the gameplay from last year's Starfield gameplay reveal. We're seeing the old, and in the visual we are jumping ahead to the new. We get some high-level talks from Todd about Starfield and how this is such an ambitious game from Bethesda Game Studios, with them going on to describe how they've never even attempted to create something quite like this. But as we cut to the actual gameplay, we get a ton of information immediately. The scene here is set on Aquila, as we could see from the HUD in the bottom left corner. I'm sure many of you know about Aquila City. This is the capital of the Freestar Collective, one of the major factions in Starfield. And despite the fact that Aquila is the home of Aquila City, it seems like we're quite a ways away from that city right now, and just kind of out in the wilderness of Aquila. This does seem to reflect how vast some of these planets are going to be. We get a decent panning shot showing that this city is nowhere in sight. In this, you can see a couple of creatures that almost have a wake up or notice us animation play as we walk up to them. I would be shocked if Bethesda placed them here with their AI turned off just for this shot, and then as the AI turns back on, they realize we're approaching. But you also get a look at some of the pretty cool dynamic weather events here. It appears that the fog is actually forming and shaping around the mountain range, just like it would in real life. It almost looks like that mountain is holding the fog. In the next few scenes, we get a rapid fire of a bunch of different worlds as Todd describes in the voiceover. And just at a surface level, you can see the sheer diversity of environments within just one system. We have the desolate moon layered with craters and grooves, a desert world named after a Greek sea monster with some of that fog in the distance again, a more tropical environment where you can see far more foliage in the foreground, as well as our first scene where we actually have a weapon equipped. We have a far rockier desert, a dreadful looking planet, giving us a peek at some of the first active weather in Starfield with a thunderstorm. You can actually see the rain effects impacting some of the rocks with their splashing, as well as these bizarre looking creatures right in front of us. And in this next planet, we get a much closer look at some of the bizarre looking fauna, of which we see several types here. And of course, some other unique looking foliage in the background. This is an alien planet after all. This planet actually has quite a few curiosities on it. The clouds in the sky do look like something's going on. They don't just seem like normal clouds. As well as you can see particulates filling the sky and even some eggs or mineable objects in the distance. And overall, the planet's really just giving me hardcore Morrowind vibes with its aesthetic. Later on, we get a more red looking planet with some very interesting looking rock structures, and one final shot looking back at that ringed planet. From there, we definitely have a few more free camera shots, including the stunning one of New Atlantis, where it's quite a ways away in the distance, and it really just shows the sheer size of this city, but also the sheer size of this planet, considering how far away we are from the city. The grass here looks amazing, some very HD grass, great job, Todd. But also we see a ship landing, though this could just be a scripted event for the Direct. We have heard in other interviews that while you're exploring around cities and locations in Starfield, ships will dynamically take off from the various spaceports of those cities. So you just be walking around minding your own business and all of a sudden a spaceship takes off a short distance away from you. And we have heard how New Atlantis, this city here, is the largest city Bethesda Game Studios has ever made. But I also believe Bethesda has a nice little twist for us with these introductory shots, as it appears that nearly all of these planets are going to be in our introductory systems, with the vast majority being in one of the first systems we go to, Alpha Centauri, that being the home of both New Atlantis and Constellation. And it seems like the second segment of shots is going to be from Cheyenne, which is going to be the system Aquila is in. The easy giveaway is you could tell right off the bat that many of these shots have this exact same ringed planet in the distance. We don't get a look at Alpha Centauri in the 2023 gameplay or during the Direct, but in the 2022 gameplay we do get a look, and we can see this familiar ringed planet sitting right there. I think things get pretty obvious or a little bit more blatant with this shot. We are on a moon facing the giant planet, and I believe it literally cuts to the other moon out in the distance in this next shot where we get the opposite perspective. And you can even see how we go from being backlit to frontlit. And to make it a bit more obvious, I think these are the various locations and where they line up. There are a few planets or moons I wasn't able to precisely place, so I wouldn't be shocked if these are from the Cheyenne system, which again is going to be home to Aquila, which we also got a shot of, and Aquila City. So the broader takeaway of all of this being that despite we are seeing a ton of different environments, this is really all just from one system. Starfield has hundreds of systems. Even though it seems like we're seeing a bunch of different environments, we're really only looking at a very small and early part part of the game. But to back things up, we also have to take a look at our HUD. The HUD has largely stayed the same compared to last year's gameplay for Starfield, but we definitely can find a few more details in this new updated gameplay. It's fairly standard HUD where your health and weapon information are going to be on the right, and when you actually do use your jetpack, a boost bar will also appear on the right side. Conversely, the left side's a bit less obvious and a bit more intricate. The outer ring of the circle is going to be your compass. You're going to get an icon for nearby locations, and these icons will change size based on how far away you are from that location. As well as you can see a bit of a continuation of the hint system from past games. You can basically see these little faded dots around the compass, and it seems like these are going to indicate an undiscovered location in that particular direction. We can also see this faded arrow in the gameplay. It almost looks similar to an undiscovered location, but I think this could actually be referring to some of your companions or your companion location. As well as you do have a bigger marker that's going to point towards certain quests and glow blue. In some other footage later on during the direct, we actually saw some times where you have two quest markers at once, which seems to indicate that tracking multiple quests at once is going to make a return for Starfield. The inner part's going to be a more familiar compass, with indicators for each of the cardinal directions, as well as one larger arrow pointing north at all times. Within that, you're going to have this planet, and the shading seems to represent the current time of day. At least that's been my interpretation thus far, and a lot of the speculation online follows with that. It does seem like this is a pretty big chunk of your HUD, making me think that time of day could be a major factor in some of the environmental threats or components of Starfield. So perhaps once it becomes nighttime, things get really cold and you have to pay attention to that, and that's why it's so large here. The O2 to CO2 meter is just really going to be a stamina bar. You're going to use this when you do things like sprint and jump, although the jetpack does have a separate bar not connected to this. When you actually approach enemies or get into combat, the outer ring of this will glow red and actually remain red while around enemies. This will basically be your combat state indicator, so I wouldn't be shocked if things like fast traveling are disabled while this is glowing red and you're still in a combat state. As well as we are able to see a variety of environmental threats pop up on this part of our HUD. In Starfield, planets will have environmental threats, and you're going to need the correct type of spacesuit to counter that. These threats will come in thermal, corrosive, airborne, and radioactive varieties. So here we see both a thermal and radiation concern on our HUD. It's not entirely clear if this means we're actively being affected or damaged by this. Obviously our health and stamina are fine, but perhaps it's just a warning that these are the threats out there and you need to wear the appropriate suit to be able to explore here. One of the things that does get me curious is the spacing of some of these icons. Here we can see the icons are weirdly spread out. This could just be an older version of the HUD. The Starfield Direct was likely filmed across multiple builds, but I'm not entirely sure what this means, and if you know, let me know in the comments. As well as there are going to be other debuffs represented on your HUD, like this red triangle over the stamina bar. Where even at other points we could see much larger overlays for things like soreness or a cough. These things are never entirely explained in the direct, and it's not easy to deduce what they mean precisely, but it seems like Starfield's definitely going to feature some kind of disease and withdrawal system that will likely hook into the food and chem system in Starfield. And I wouldn't be shocked if some of this is going to be how some of the environmental threats will affect your character. But one of the other pretty curious aspects of all of this is the singular star. In real life, Alpha Centauri is a triple star system, but based off the visuals here from the 2022 gameplay and even what we're seeing in the actual planetary shots from the 2023 gameplay, we only see a singular star at the center of this system, which is interesting. On the map, we could see other multi-star systems, so it's not clear why this one is only down to one, but perhaps something actually happened here. Perhaps there's a lore or story reason why Alpha Centauri is no longer a triple star system. In the voiceover, we hear how Starfield will realistically simulate the galaxy around you, taking into account things like the type of star and even the makeup of your planet's atmosphere. So on one hand, this should just be awesome visually, hanging out on planet's surface and watching as space is actively simulating and unfolding around you, but this also seems to be a confirmation that different types of stars will be a relevant factor here, and the type of star around you will likely interact with the type of atmosphere that your planet currently has. So when choosing a planet to settle on, what type of star is around and what type of atmosphere that planet has may actually be deciding factors. Starfield is using real-time global illumination. This is that dynamic lighting system you see throughout the entirety of the Direct, and it looks very impressive, a clear upgrade over last year. It definitely seems like this is doing a lot of the heavy lifting to make this trailer just look so freaking pretty, and in real terms you could see even just here from these introductory shots how a distant planet will influence and be reflected on this moon. Starfield has interplanetary reflections and lighting, although this does not appear to be full-on ray tracing. Ray tracing is definitely a buzzword as of late, and if this was real ray tracing, light rays would be simulated in a more realistic manner compared to what we have in Starfield, where the lighting is being simulated in a more localized way. As of right now, it's not entirely clear if Starfield will feature ray tracing tracing or not, but it definitely was not on in the Direct. This shot of an arch is a very interesting one, as this is very likely a scene on Earth. This arch is believed to be the St. Louis Arch, or Gateway Arch. And based off the visuals here, it looks like Earth is largely destroyed and abandoned. It almost looks like a desert landscape now. And there's some cracks in the Earth, which is a concerning detail that likely spells a disastrous past for Earth and its inhabitants. I could speculate literally all day about why this happened, but I figure we should probably just wait a couple of months and find out the real answer. There's a lot of people talking about how featuring the Gateway Arch is rather random. There are a lot of other very notable landmarks in the United States that could have been featured, so why this one? Well, it actually may be for lore reasons. Due to the unique design of the Gateway Arch, it is meant to be surprisingly durable, so it outlasting the structures around it isn't all that crazy. This of course also suggests that Earth is going to be an explorable planet in Starfield. Later on we could actually see it from the system view, and although it looks a bit more desolate, it also very much so looks landable. You have to imagine there's going to be a ton of other monuments to find here, as well as other Easter eggs scattered throughout the planet, but pretty much every indication is that by the time of 2033, the events of Starfield, Earth is destroyed. Still technically there, but largely desolate. But then we finally get to a more prolonged gameplay segment. We get to see Starfield's new animation system on display. A new animation system was one of the first things we actually knew about Starfield, and in general, I think animations from the Direct look really good. The sprint was a little bit odd to me. We are very leaned over for sprinting, and of course in Starfield, you will have the options for both a first and third person camera. Just from a visual perspective, I think this planet looks amazing, and we cut to some of the first scanning gameplay. There is a dedicated section to this in the Direct, so we will go more in depth then, but one pretty cool aspect of this is we can see as you open up your scanner, we can identify a distant undiscovered location. You can see on the compass that there is an undiscovered location over there, and with our scanner, we find out a bit more info on it, specifically that it is a structure of some kind, as well as our compass updates. Although it still seems to not be the full picture, as we scan two different areas and each is identified as a structure, but with different map markers. So it seems like in scanning an unknown location, you get a bit closer to the answer, but you don't have the full picture yet. You have to actually get to that location on foot to find out what exactly it is. In the voiceover, Todd Howard describes how exploration is going to be a bit different in Starfield. You're typically going to be exploring the area you landed in. We know that in Starfield, there's not going to be any types of vehicles on land. Your spaceship won't be usable on a planet, and there's no actual land vehicles like rovers. So it seems like the gameplay loop here is largely going to be landing in a certain area, exploring in the walkable vicinity around your spaceship, but then getting back into the spaceship and landing somewhere else if there's a point of interest. The planets seem fully walkable in this game, like you could hypothetically walk across the entire thing, but since you are going to be on foot, it'll take literal ages to do that. Then we approach this abandoned mine and discover it. You can see our compass icon fills with color, indicating it is fully discovered and likely now a fast travelable location. The XP bar is going to be in the center of the screen in this game. This has received quite a bit of pushback, and it definitely obscures your view somewhat, but as mentioned a bit earlier, right as we jump into combat, your compass flashes, indicating your gameplay state. And the first updated look at combat gameplay is very interesting. One of the big complaints from the first gameplay was how enemies seemed quite stiff. And when taking shots as we unload on this enemy here, it actually seems like this continues. They barely have any feedback from our shots. Thankfully though, it seems like this is the outlier, as with some of the other combat sequences, we could definitely see stagger-like sequences and animations that play on enemies, and they are affected by the momentum of our shots and even do have some kind of stagger mechanic. We get our first look at one of these jetpack explosions. These are scattered all throughout the Direct, and it basically seems like if you land enough shots on an enemy's jetpack, it'll actually fire off and explode as the enemy dies. As well, Starfield definitely features blood spatter now in a much larger way compared to the first gameplay. Some enemies in this game are going to be a bit tougher. Most of the enemies we encountered in this short gameplay just have one white health bar, but this first enemy also has a segmented red bar under the white one. And the way this will work is each red segment will refill the big white bar. So you can see here, as we attack this enemy, deplete his white health bar, the first red section gets into action, and as that depletes, the white bar immediately starts to fill back up. I see this almost as an alternate take to the legendary enemy system from past games, where now higher tier enemies will basically have multiple health bars you'll have to blow through, and depending on how segmented this bottom bar is will indicate how many times their initial first white health bar can refill. Although something that is very nice is you can actually over damage here. So basically if you have one incredibly powerful shot, you can actually break through multiple health bar refills. Earlier on in the gameplay when we opened our scanner, we could see this planet has 0.52 gravity, and we can see the effects of that here. We jump much higher with an almost floating like descent, But even just as we take out this enemy, we can see the force of our shots leads to their body flipping from the momentum, and they're propelled throughout the low gravity environment. As soon as we finish off the final enemy, we could see our compass return to its white state, as well as we could see some progress made on one of these skill challenges, although we'll talk about that more in depth later. As we go to loot the spacer, we can see a particularly familiar quick loot screen. Transfer likely will open up a full window just like in Fallout 4, but one notable difference here is that for some reason the armor of this enemy is not lootable. Throughout much of the gameplay, really the vast majority of the gameplay, you are not able to loot armor, but in a couple of scenes you are able to, and it seems like it might be tied to melee weapons or something around that. So though most of the time armor isn't lootable, it seems like it is technically lootable if you meet the right circumstances. We get some basic gameplay of looting and interacting with some objects. This honestly looks very similar to other Bethesda Game Studios games, although the interior screen is completely redesigned here. We have a new 6-section inventory, and it honestly is a pretty interesting layout. The sections are quite familiar. It's going to be skills, inventory, quests, spaceship, map, and then one secret section, but more on that later on. But instead of the skills section of our inventory just reading skills, the menus will represent the last thing that was used. Like maybe just recently a skill point was spent on laser, so that's what pops up here. The Eon is our currently equipped weapon, so that is there instead of our inventory just being listed. The quick access menu buttons at the bottom are also pretty interesting. They speak to what Bethesda Game Studios intends for us to be using often. So we see options to quickly switch to a system view, see our status, which could be connected to some of the health components we talked about a bit earlier, like coughing or being sick, as well as even just setting course to other planets. Honestly, most of this is pretty self-explanatory, but two of the other notable things I notice are we can see local time, which is going to correspond to the time on this planet, but also a second UT time. Perhaps UT time is something like universal time, where the local time is just planet-based. UT time is going to be across the entire galaxy, what every planet uses, or at least what every planet is aware of as you travel from planet to planet, and the local time will drastically change. The minutes being different definitely suggests to me that there's going to be some kind of time dilation effect depending on which planet you land on, so time will likely move more quickly or slowly from one planet to another, with longer or shorter day-night cycles depending on the planet's location. And we can see our ship is listed as Class A with a 20 light-year jump range. Jumping is of course how you're going to get around in Starfield, and we know the entire map is 50 light years large. So perhaps getting to 20 light years is quite easy as it's done here at just level 11, but getting to the edges of the map may be quite expensive and actually require extensive upgrades. We could also see our ship's hull health, but it's not entirely clear what actually happens if this reaches 0. I guess your ship just explodes and you'll die, being able to restart from a last checkpoint or save. As we get into our inventory, we can see a ton of information at once. Each listing on the left-hand side is a different inventory category, but Bethesda made it so you can see which items you have equipped just at a glance for each category. And as you hover over them, it'll even give you the stats of that equipped item. With this UI design overall, it feels like they really are feeding you a ton of information without making you dive deeper into the menus. Apparel appears to be broken up in a pretty similar way to past games. Spacesuits broken up into suit and helmet, but then also separate options for packs as well as your actual outfit under the spacesuit. The character currently has 16,309 credits, which is the USS Reliance prefix code from Star Trek. There's going to be quite a few little Easter eggs like this around numbers, but I'll definitely miss some others. So if you pick up some Easter eggs around numbers, let me know in the comments down below. But then as we transition into the dedicated weapons menu, we can see a lot of familiar things. Favoriting weapons is returning, as well as your currently equipped weapon gets a little notch on it so you can easily identify it. Weapon naming will follow that of past Fallout games with prefixes like refined or calibrated, and there's even the toggleable option of comparing weapons to your currently equipped weapon. That's why some of these stats are in red or green, meaning it is either better or worse than what we currently have equipped. The stats don't seem to go too in depth, but I honestly think that's largely fine for a game like this. And even different damage types are coming back, as we can see both physical damage and energy damage here. One of the new things is a sort button. I assume this means either sorting by name or per shot damage, as those are the two major categories, although it is definitely nice to have some of this functionality from day one and not having to wait for better mods. And this Razorback pistol just seems godly. 109 damage per shot and just 10 less range than a rifle. The spacesuit menu will be much of the same. We have a new option to hide our spacesuits in settlements, which is very nice, but spacesuits are going to have resistances for combat with physical, energy, and as well as electromagnetic defenses, but also separate environmental resistances as we discussed a bit earlier for planets. And one of the big takeaways around environmental resistances are they're very neat numbers, everything ending in a 5 or 0. This likely means it's a fairly straightforward value, as I imagine on a planet you might see, okay, I need over 20 radiation resistance, and you either make the cut or you don't. The spacesuit helmet menu is almost identical, but with a new option to hide your helmet in breathable areas. The defense bonuses of the helmet and spacesuit likely stack as a value, so it's going to add those both together. The aid section is going to once again be a mix of both healing items as well as food and drink. Alien jerky is definitely a fun one. Edible aliens are apparently in Starfield, but also things like orange juice, aka the best juice, except not in Starfield, as orange juice in this game will actually reduce your HP by 1 per second for a minute, although it will boost your stamina. All these food items honestly seem pretty simple. Most of them are just restoring your HP, but one really nice quality of life feature is the health bar is actually shown. I imagine if you had lower health, it'll give you a preview of how much of your health bar will be restored on consumption of one of these items. And although it doesn't seem like Starfield's going to have a full-fledged survival mode where you must eat and drink, food is still handy as a stat booster just to boost your HP. And med packs have 0 weight in Starfield, which is an incredibly nice feature. But transitioning back into the open world, we find ourselves here walking up to our ship and Vasco. We heard in the voiceover how you're always going to have the option to fast travel to your ship, which is very nice. And it seems like you can basically have certain companions wait for you at your ship instead of following you places, which is a pretty nice feature because sometimes you want them around, but you just don't want them around right now. Although one curious part is it doesn't actually seem like there's a map marker for your ship, or nothing on our HUD seems to indicate that our ship is right over there. Like as you go to board the ship, there is a marker, but on your compass, there isn't anything. There is this little white arrow that could be just pointing to your ship at all times, but honestly, it almost looks like it's off to the side as we're standing here. We get a nice look at Vasco, and it does look like he has some pouches strapped to his body, so when we load him with 1,000 pounds, immersion can still be maintained. Thanks, pouches. But as you jump onto your ship, Bethesda actually did a sneaky cut here. Although it appears like it's just seconds later, it seems like this was actually a fairly large time jump. Our stamina is no longer regenerating, and our health bar now has an orange section lowering our overall health. A different weapon is equipped on our character, and perhaps what we're seeing here is the disease system, or maybe even some type of environmental damage is hindering us. We no longer have oxygen, aka stamina, and we do have a radiation alert, so perhaps that's what's happening here. We're taking radiation damage and as such getting debuffs. And another nice option is you could either just board the ship directly and walk around, or directly transport yourself to the cockpit for takeoff. We then get this transition to a cinematic view as we watch our ship take off, and I actually think this is how it'll look in game. I believe as you transition from planet to space, this cutscene, which is hopefully skippable, will play, and the fade to black would typically unfade to us at the controls of our spaceship in space. But then we do get a nice look inside of our ship, and one of the first things I noticed was our HUD changing again. Here we are just walking around our ship up in space, and we could see a star or planet cluster instead of just being one big planet, as well as that little white arrow remains, which definitely makes me think it is pointing towards a companion. We know ship interiors are customizable and can definitely change, so I don't want to break down this layout all that much. And a lot of the things that are scattered around or the details in the ship are exactly the same from the release date teaser. We can see this shot out helmet making a return, patches, and even this picture of Vasco are back, as well as more digging into the artifact. This model of a sphere on top of a pyramid seems notable, but I honestly have no idea what it is. And that navigation table is still here, and as we use that, it transitions us to the star map. We get a view of the planet we were just on, with a ton of details and characteristics that are specific down to a planetary level. Planets have a certain type, this one being a rock planet, but also things like gravity and temperature. Gravity is of course going to be fairly obvious, but temperature is one of the things I find interesting. Time of day is very well represented on the HUD. I wonder if nighttime can get very cold on some planets and daytime can get very hot with gameplay impacts. There are entries for both the specific type of atmosphere and magnetosphere. You can think of a magnetosphere almost like a shield around a planet. It's going to be based off the magnetic fields created by that planet's core, and it'll protect against things like solar wind and even protect against solar radiation. This particular planet has a weak magnetosphere, so I wonder if that's why we're experiencing radiation issues while we were walking on it. There's going to be specific categories for the types of flora, fauna, and even the water on a planet. And if all of that somehow wasn't enough, we also get to see the specific resources and traits of this planet. There's a lot of details for just one random planet, and now you could extrapolate this to 1,000 planets and you could see the scale of Starfield. Planetary traits are pretty interesting. We only see a couple during the gameplay overall, and it's not entirely clear what this will mean for one planet versus versus another. But with traits and resources being there, you have to imagine there'll be things like a gold mine planets that'll have a lot of resources on them and will definitely be valuable to you. And as we transition to some of the other planets or even some of the moons, you can see that there is definitely going to be quite a bit of variation in how many resources are on a given planet. You're also able to see your total survey completion from a glance. That is the process of scanning all of the things on a planet. And we have heard how once you complete a survey, you will be able to sell it for a decent amount of money. But also we can see just us scanning around the planet overall, and it almost looks like you can really pick any location to land, whether it be random wilderness or one of the discovered locations on that planet. As well as we do see a show me button down below, which could give you a preview of that landing spot. The sheer scale here is pretty wild. Like hypothetically, you can walk from the civilian outpost to the industrial outpost. But how long would that actually take in real life? Are you talking hours, days, or maybe even weeks? As we back up to the full-on system view, you can see that survey mechanic well represented again, as we do have survey stats for the overall system and each location within it. Systems in Starfield will have levels. This seems to be a rough level gating for how prepared or not prepared you are for each one, as well as there's a lot of nice indicators. 3 dots for planets with things on them to do. This blue icon seems to represent a quest on a planet, and a green arrow for the planet we are currently at. But just overall, the visual of the gravitational waves being cast by each celestial body is awesome. That is what these lines represent, and it's a really cool visual. I don't know if they're going to have that much impact on actual gameplay, but they definitely look cool. And eventually you can get to the full-on galaxy view. And it seems like notable systems are going to get a name over them. Crix is the home of the Crimson Fleet, while Cheyenne is going to be home of the Freestar Collective. It's not entirely clear why some of these planets or systems are going to be red and some others are going to be white, but definitely seems like that's relevant to the game overall. Jumping using your grav drive is the main method of crossing far distances in Starfield, and it has several variables associated with it. As we talked about earlier, the grav drive has a certain max jump distance. Here it's going to be 20 light years. But also the grav drive will use fuel, and you can seemingly run out of fuel and have to replenish. In past interviews, Todd Howard has confirmed that typical spaceflight, like just flying around, will not use fuel, but grav jumping will, and it seems like this will gamify the system and actually limit how far you could jump without refueling. As we approach the planet Jemison, we have to go through a contraband scan to enter. This seemingly around space piracy and items that aren't meant to be on board. It even seems like you may have a limited amount of inventory to hide illegal items. And also as we approach planet Jemison, home to the largest city in Starfield with New Atlantis, you can see a ton of other ships flying around the planet, which I think is a really cool detail. It seems like traffic around actually active areas is well represented here. And each of the spaceships flying around us also have arrows that indicate which direction they're moving in. Pretty similar to the sequence for getting into space, the docking sequence or cutscene does seem to be in game. This is actually what you're going to see as you land in major cities. New Atlantis is gigantic. I mean, you could just kind of tell this is a fully explorable city, and from the gameplay it looks immense. But we know explicitly that this is the biggest city Bethesda Game Studios has ever built for one of their games, both in terms of scale and even how many quests and crowds are here. And throughout this, you're going to see several major corporations in Starfield have locations here, like Galbank or even the Settled Systems News Network. The city itself is a big one. It is located on planet Jemison, which appears to be one of the first planets we'll be able to travel to, and this is also where Constellation, our primary faction, is located. New Atlantis itself is going to be controlled by United Colonies, the largest faction in all of Starfield, as well as New Atlantis will have a security checkpoint, and through here there are actually trains, as the city does feature a subway-like system for getting around that is actually functional. But honestly, what strikes me most about some of these shots of New Atlantis is what isn't in the city. This one shot gives you a great view of the outside world, and in Starfield you could just kind of go there. Like we saw in the planetary view, New Atlantis is really just a small part of a full-scale planet to explore. And as we get some of these panning shots of New Atlantis focusing on NPCs, notice how well they are dressed and even the diversity among the NPCs. New Atlantis is really meant to be a mixing pot, but it's also clearly higher class overall, which I think is pretty well represented as you contrast some of these NPCs to other ones we'll see later on. We have what I think is a pretty cool looking security robot approach us. It almost looks like an edited version of Vasco, but this one equipped for riot control. And we know Starfield won't have hyper intelligent robots based on some interviews, but they can speak, and this one describes how this memorial is for the Colony War. The Colony War happened 20 years prior to the events of Starfield, and it was between the United Colonies and Freestar Collective. Not much is really known about what happened during that war, but we know these two factions are now at peace, and it was described that this is an uneasy peace, so there seems like there's definitely still tension. And here we could actually see the memorial that reflects the fallen United Colony soldiers in the Colony War. In these next few shots, there really isn't a ton to break down. We just see characters going through their day-to-day lives. And it looks impressive, like these characters actually have have simulated routes like getting morning coffee, but it honestly is hard from this brief gameplay to tell how in-depth these character routes actually go. But then we move over to Constellation, and they're almost fort-like looking base. To gain access to this, we have to use our Chronomark Life Pack Interlink, aka the Starfield Watch, and it seems to almost be akin to the Fallout Pip-Boy, as well as the Constellation edition of the game will actually come with a real-life variant of this watch, which is pretty cool. Constellation is going to be the last group of space explorers and the faction that we are primarily joining in Starfield. It's described how by the time of Starfield in 2330, they're almost like a mysterious group. They've been around for 142 years, and they're trying to answer humanity's biggest questions, but not many people have seen Constellation. In their officer HQ, there's a ton of references to old explorers. Here we have a picture of Ferdinand Magellan, who led the first expedition to circumnavigate the world. This boat looks like the USS Constitution, that same boat from Fallout 4, as well as the oldest commissioned warship that's still afloat, at least in today's time. Seemingly by the time of Starfield, it'll no longer be afloat due to what happened to Earth. This is one of the Apollo Arrow landers, and behind it, it seems like it's Edmund Hillary, the first person to summit Mount Everest, although I'm not really sure who this woman is. This camera is from the Curiosity rover that landed on Mars. But this next scene seems like it's going to be one of the big ones. It's our intro into Constellation and really into Starfield as a whole. Basically, we're going to begin Starfield as a miner, and in the process of, I guess, mining, we find this artifact that you can see sticking out of the rocks. It seems like in touching this, our character has some kind of vision. It's this experience between the vision, finding the artifact, and all of this that actually gets us into Constellation in the first place. And we can actually see, as we walk up, they have several artifacts of their own. As well as during the scene, we could spot several more explorers in the background. Amelia Earhart has her famous pose on a plane here, as well as this boat is going to be the RV Calypso, at least probably. This is a boat that has been retrofitted numerous times and truly sailed around the world for military purposes, research, and even just transportation. The other two people I'm not sure of. It definitely looks like it's going to be an astronaut or cosmonaut of some kind, but after a few days, nobody has been able to identify them, so I wouldn't be shocked if these are some of the founding members of Constellation. And what happens next in the trailer is particularly interesting. The artifacts float together, and the NPCs declare how they must be a part of a set, and built by those outside of the settled systems. This definitely hints at some kind of intelligent aliens being out there, and this seems to kick off our journey of figuring out what these artifacts are and probably trying to finish the set overall. From there, they go into the background of each of the major Constellation members, but this is basically said verbatim in the direct, so I'm not going to just reiterate that. And we get one pretty interesting shot showing us a spaceship showroom that just looks epic. And perhaps this is not just for show. We have heard how you can buy spaceships in Starfield or build them. So maybe we can literally go to the showroom and buy one of these prefab spaceships for ourselves if you have the credits for it, that is. Barrett is going to be another member of Constellation and seemingly our ride to Constellation. You can see here we are holding the artifact and still in our Argos extractor suit. This is very early on in the game, and it seems like Barrett is going to be the first member of Constellation we ever meet, and he's going to really be the one that introduces us into the faction, gives us a watch and everything. It looks like Barrett may even be arriving in Frontier, what ends up becoming our spaceship, and Vasco is standing beside him. So perhaps this is really the moment where Starfield will open up and we unlock all of these things. We get a look at some more artifact related things. Based off some of the trailers, it seems like there could be several planets with gravity defying artifacts built on them, with this really just being one of them. This shot here is visually stunning, and in a past interview, Todd Howard says sometimes you'll settle a certain planet just for the view. And I think this is a great example as to how that could come together. I could definitely see people settling on this planet just because of how pretty it is when you look up. In the voiceover, they describe how this is just the start of our journey in Starfield, and how there's going to be many other stories to explore even beyond the artifact. It seems like we get a preview of some of the side quests in Starfield. We see a small base with a spaceship docked there, this likely just being a one-off home that we'll do some questing at, and from there it cuts to something very morbid, an adult woman taking a child to several grave sites. This definitely looks like a side quest, but one of the curious parts is this woman definitely seems like she's wearing a Constellation suit, so perhaps this is actually us taking a child who is the last survivor of some kind of space colony to the graves of all of the other people that lived here. The next few shots don't really have much to break down, but they are just pure eye candy, and I definitely wanted to highlight them as during the direct they do go by relatively quickly. This lush planet looks epic with some awesome looking creatures, and I just love the design of these guys, even down to their circular tails. And here it just really looks like we have an uncharted new land that we're going to be embarking into. But then we also cut to the scary. This looks like that same creature we could briefly see in the initial gameplay, and it seems to be the one that comes from that lab on Crete. This thing is terrifying, and I think it serves as a reminder that Starfield is going to have jump scares. Unlike past Bethesda Bethesda Game Studios games, in this one you'll be constantly visiting new locations that you've never been before. I imagine on quite a few of those planets, those threats may just sneak up on you, and you won't even know necessarily which creatures are threats versus which creatures aren't threats on different planets. But this then transitions us into some of the faction-specific commentary for Starfield. We get lots of great panning shots of New Atlantis, and hear how this is the first major human settlement in space, whose inhabitants consider themselves the children of Earth. This is humanity's legacy, the continuation of those people. And this is honestly an interesting commentary. Cydonia, another major city we'll see in a moment, has in the past been described as one of the first space settlements ever established, so which is older here? You would have to imagine Cydonia, which is located on Mars, would have been set up much earlier compared to New Atlantis, which is going to be in a different system altogether. As we pan by these flags, it's really not clear what each of these flags do represent, but given the faction is named United Colonies, I wouldn't be shocked if these are the individual colonies that make up this coalition. And speaking of, UC has quite a few sub-factions and even governing bodies that we can see in the gameplay. MASS, as you can see in some of the signs in the background, is the military, administrative, and scientific triumvirate, and basically seems to be the leadership component of the United Colonies. These heavily armored guards are the UCSEC. This is very likely the United Colony Security, and it's really going to be the local police force in some of the major United Colonies locations. Even their armors actually seem to match pretty closely with what the security robots were wearing. The United Colonies Vanguard, we were asked to join this particular group in the Direct's commentary, and we get a really good look at exhibits featuring them in New Atlantis. Definitely seems like these guys are an elite status unit, so some kind of military force, and much of the speculation thus far has been that this is actually a ground unit, because we have also heard about the UC SysDef, likely referring to the United Colonies System Defense, which just sounds like it would be the Space Force, while the United Colonies Vanguard would be the ground force. Basically, the Vanguard are the Marines, while SysDef is the Air Force, or I guess nowadays really the Space Force. I don't really have much to break down in these armors, but they just look awesome. The style and design, a lot of the things in Starfield are really top tier. We hear about getting our own UC citizenship by joining up with the Vanguard. I wouldn't be surprised if this is a real thing, like unlocking the ability to buy a home in New Atlantis, or even becoming accepted in the city of the future. There's a trait around being a United Colonies native, which we don't have the description for just yet, but it seems very likely that this could tie in here, so perhaps you could actually start off the game with United Colonies citizenship and any benefits that come with that. This panning away shot is just stunning, wallpaper worthy, but I actually think it also gives us one of the best looks of the dynamic takeoff and landing system. You can see a ship coming in for a landing in New Atlantis, and look at the size of the shadow that thing is casting. But also another ship taking off, and it almost looks like a full-on vertical takeoff from that one. As mentioned before, we have heard that this will happen as you are just walking around some of the cities, so it seems like this will really be as epic and immersive as it's being portrayed as. You walk around and spaceships take off around you. We get our first good look within Cydonia and find out it is a primarily mining city for the United Colonies, which that alone would suggest that the United Colonies has been in power for a very long time if one of the earliest Mars colonies belongs to and is controlled by that faction. We get some cool visuals here, like the familiar hours without incident sign, but also the cutter is being used by an NPC. This is the same mining laser we use, and we have it on our character at all times. The second you open up your scanner, the cutter will automatically be equipped for you. There honestly isn't much to break down here, just largely panning shots of the inner workings of Cydonia. I know though, we do begin Starfield as a miner ourselves, it doesn't seem like we start the game in Cydonia. It seems like this will be a ways away and we come here later. But then we are finally introduced into what seems like it's going to be one of the major alternates to the United Colonies, the more wild and independent Free Star Collective. This is going to be a coalition of 3-star systems. And this planet here with Aquila is the same exact planet we saw in the opening shot of the Direct, but now we're getting a look at Aquila City specifically. The Free Star Collective are very different compared to the United Colonies. These are more of a frontiersman people who value freedom above all else, and they have the second largest military in the galaxy. And ideologically, they seem like the radical opposite. The United Colonies are that spacer future, while the Free Star Collective have a lot of old world values still being maintained, but also seem very libertarian. And even just visually in their technology. The United Colonies have a riot security robot guarding a memorial versus a much simpler looking robot looks to just be farming for the Free Star Collective. And the ultimate example of this is the main road in Aquila City being a massive contrast to the spacer industrialists in New Atlantis. The shot is awesome. We can see armed guards greeting us, but also some store names alone scream old-timey. The hitching post, Shepherd's General Store, Roland Arms, and then, just as a perfect contrast, Spaceport. The city itself has this beautiful mix of an old western and our spacer future. Here we have an interesting scene just in front of the Stone Root Inn, and it almost looks like we have a bag of spice. This is certainly giving Dune vibes, but I'm honestly not entirely sure what this is. But now inside of the Stone Root Inn, the theme continues with a rifle behind the bar, some trophy hanging above, and even the bartender looks straight out of Westworld. Aquila is the home to the Ashta, terrifying creatures described as being a cross between a velociraptor and a wolf. And although we can see one here, this bar hanging skeleton definitely looks a bit different. Although even if it's not an Ashta, it definitely looks like some other kind of horrifying creature. Aquila City has some interesting names for its major locations. We see this interior is the Rock, and earlier on we saw the Core, Co Plaza, and even Midtown. Here we can actually see a Crimson Fleet pirate in a cell, but seemingly they have their full armor on, which is pretty interesting. And we hear about the Freestar Rangers, likely the Freestar Collective counterpart to the UC Vanguard, and I suspect the Vanguard and Rangers will be our paths to joining each of these major factions. And it looks like the person we are dueling with here may even be Sam Coe. This is going to be one of the available companions, which we'll talk about a bit later. The fourth and final major city is Neon. Yes, Starfield only has 4 major cities, but more smaller cities, and even space stations are in the game. The first look at Neon appears to be from the landing port. If you've been following Starfield, you may remember Neon, as it had this epic concept art. And we can see from the overlay that Neon is in Freestar Collective space. Although the faction doesn't seem to necessarily control it, it's in their airspace, or really their space. And it seems like these 4 major cities are divvied up between the 2 big factions. The Freestar Collective has Aquila City and Neon, while the United Colonies has Sidonia and New Atlantis. Neon is like a space Las Vegas and described as a pleasure city through and through. It is controlled by Ryujin Industries, with their primary product being the fish Aurora. This fish has psychotropic properties, making it a big appeal here. And on this main road, we could see space Las Vegas truly represented. We could see yet another SSNN sign, which are also in New Atlantis, but also the Vol 2 Hotel. Vol 2 is the planet Neon is on, and other shops like a clothing store and even a medical store. It seems like this is very likely to be the Ryujin Industries HQ. Ryujin is a sea deity in Japanese mythology, translating to dragon god, almost like a sea serpent, which that is very well represented, with flowing water and even a Ryujin looking carving hanging in the center. In Starfield, I think it's going to be really interesting to see how powerful corporations contrast with powerful governments. We know Ryujin Industries is going to be a major player with Neon, but how much power do they really have compared to something like the United Colonies or even the Freestar Collective? During the scene, the character mentions how if we have morality issues, this is definitely not the job for us. We heard from the ESRB rating for Starfield that we can set up things like an illegal chem lab, and I imagine that could tie in here with us making Aurora illegally. And in the scene, it appears once again that Sam Coe is there with us. But then we finally get to see some Aurora production itself, with the boxes stamped Xenofresh. Xenofresh are the corporation that originally settled on Neon. They just wanted to set up a fishing settlement before they realized that, oh, all of these fish have psychotropic properties and we could definitely use them in other ways. And then we go into the Astral Lounge, where we see ads for Aurora describing it as the best trip in the settled systems, and these guys dancing. I don't honestly think anything else needs to be said here, but I wanted to highlight these guys dancing. They're just some fellas having a good time with quite a few spectators. Here we get a look at a bit grimier area of Neon known as the Akuchi Market, where we can see things like apartments and even a space terminal. The Akuchi is another type of Japanese sea serpent from its mythology, as well as the Freestar Rangers have an outpost here, as they are the controllers of this system. We see these enhanced signs a few times, and it seems like this could be an Aurora dispensary of sorts, or maybe even just a bar, and some employees are hanging out outside of it. And the Freestar Rangers aren't the only force in town, as we could also see a neon security sign in the background. And what to me was honestly one of the funniest parts about Neon is we could see this Ryujin terminal with a line just outside of Akuchi Market. It has the same logo as we saw in the office. Next to the info kiosk on the wall, it reads "Our product, our life," so I think this is literally a Ryujin official kiosk to get details on the effects of Aurora, the chem they sell you. Imagine rolling into Las Vegas and having kiosks to explain the effects of various chems that you can buy there. Honestly, that's not a horrible idea, but it's kind of hilarious to see it in action here in Neon. But then we also start to see some of the criminal elements in Neon, which honestly just feels very fitting given the look and feel of the rest of this city. This jacket seems to read strikers, and we can see that there's some very bad stuff happening in this city, and you have to imagine there's going to be extensive side quests exploring Neon's criminal underbelly. But it's also described how outside of civilized space, which seems to refer to the space controlled by United Colonies or Freestar, there is unclaimed space, which is home to some of the most hostile factions in the galaxy. This snake is a reference to the Serpent religion. This is the faction known as the House of Varun. And there's even a trait in Starfield where you can grow up worshipping the Great Serpent, leading to an increased health and endurance as long as you jump often enough. This faction seems to have some pretty gnarly armor, and we could see ourselves taking out some of the fanatical zealots of the faction later on. We also get a peek at the new sneak caution meter, which does honestly look quite interesting. It seems like these black bars filling are actually a real gameplay element, not just for aesthetic purposes, but I can't make out what exactly they could be for. And for a faction that is based on the more fringe side of the settled systems, they certainly have quite a bit of a setup. Outside of that, we get another preview of a bit of an out there faction with the Red Mile, who have a base on Parima 3, which is somewhat familiar. That earlier gameplay where we take out several spacers was filmed on Parima 4, likely indicating that these two are in the same system. These guys seem wild, and it almost looks like you literally have to run a mile. There's likely going to be some threats along the way, hence the naming of Red Mile, but on the screens in their base, they're playing casino games like blackjack or poker. The key is easily one of the coolest bases we see in my opinion. This is the home of the Crimson Fleet pirates, who are joinable, and yes, their base is a giant space station. And you can even see a variety of ships that are already docked onto the station. We can see from the inside that this is a captured United Colony station, and we know that from design documents, the Crimson Fleet pirates are impeding on not only the United Colony space, but also Freestar Collective space. From there, we really just get a rapid fire of some of the locations we just saw. This beach that looks like it may be near New Atlantis, or at the very least in United Colony's territory, as this robot does look like the security robot. We see the sheer size of the fish for Aurora, as well as this absolutely epic shot of a ship taking off. We get some surprisingly revealing behind the scenes shots. Here we can see Sol, aka our own solar system, and while of course we knew we would be coming here as Sidonia is on Mars, we could also see a rather desolate and colorless looking Earth, like there's no more water or greenery here. This of course was also represented and reflected in the Earth shots we saw earlier, but it makes me wonder if perhaps there was a global warming like event that dried up some of the oceans on the planet. Either way, this icon means something is there, and it serves as further confirmation that we can in fact travel to Earth. We could also see this is still a United Colonies controlled system, and we even have a bounty with that faction. We get a quick peek confirming that Mars does not have any flora or fauna, sadly no life on Mars outside of the human colonizers. And we get the shot of a rifle that I don't believe we see another time during the Direct, so I wanted to highlight it. Also, this is back on Proxima 4. And here we finally have that shot of a 6th dot or skill tree, as we can see at the top here. While the equipped weapon here is named Ashta Tamer, which is just awesome. Ashta being those creatures on Aquila, and the name here makes me think this could potentially even be a unique weapon of some kind. It's described how real faces were scanned for the character builder in Starfield, and how basically every character you see in this game is something you can create yourself using the character builder. And this shot with us waking up very well may be the very first thing you see in Starfield. Right after you start a new game, it's very likely that this will play. This is at our mining operation. You can see this woman is holding the artifact we find. You're very likely locked into the first person for this initial perspective because you haven't created your own character yet. But of course, immediately after, you are creating your new character. And we can see here how the character creator is all themed around Argos Extractors, which is the mining company we begin the game as an employee of. The character customization seems almost identical to what we saw last year. And one cool detail is you aren't locked in, as it reads, biometric customizations can be changed later by visiting a genetic facility. So it seems like you can evolve the appearance of your character over time, even after leaving the character creator. And one of the things I really like is the character creator is going to use a mix of presets with more in-depth options. So you're going to have all of these various presets, but also on some of them, a choice to further refine them with more specific edits, like you could see here on the mouth. We also get another look at backgrounds. These have an interesting dichotomy in Starfield, as on one hand, you're going to get 3 starting skills to define your character, so you kind of get a jump start down a certain build path, but outside of that, there's also going to be unique interactions in the game based off of your background. Most of these are fairly self-explanatory: an explorer who wants to uncover more of space and cares little for colonization, Diplomat is going to be the speech-focused one, Cyberneticist is a bit more interesting as it mentions implants and even upgrades being available. This background is all about combining man and machine, and although we haven't seen implants in the actual gameplay, this definitely makes it sound like it could be a thing. Cyber Runner sounds quite fun. It's basically going to be the corpo background where you sacrifice your morals for money, and Combat Medic is basically just a doctor background, and being a chef, and hopefully there's some interesting interactions around cooking aliens in Starfield, but in the actual gameplay we could see a variety of these backgrounds will almost act like a skill check in dialogue, with unique options popping up if we have a certain background at times. We can see here, at least for Chef, we can use it almost immediately with this intro minor character, and in this Beast Hunter shot, we are also very likely in the early stages of the game. We're in a fancy restaurant on Jemison, so likely within New Atlantis itself, and the quest seems to be just taking down one particular enemy, which to me very much so gives off those early quest tutorial-esque vibes. And one of the other things I noticed about this restaurant is just look at how many people are here. We have heard how Starfield's going to have a lot of NPCs, but this is one of the first examples to really strike me. There is a lot of people for just some random restaurant. Later on, we are able to see Diplomat in action. This being the speech-based option, it too just kind of acts like a skill check. Based on the other choices, it basically seems like having the Diplomat background allows us to bypass having to convince the other person that we're qualified for the job, which is very similar to what we see happening with Beast Hunter. Perhaps this is largely how backgrounds will function. Although we also see Cyber Runner pop up in a more meaningful way, as this is going to be during the new persuasion minigame. It seems like you just have an extra persuasion method due to your background, but it's not entirely clear if that will actually work. It seems like it is just another attempt at persuading an NPC and not necessarily a surefire success. We've seen the persuasion minigame in the past, and the way this seems to work is you're going to have different turns, and each turn you're going to have a different attempt to persuade someone using each of these dialogue lines. But how successful that dialogue line is or isn't is going to be based off that character. It seems like it's a bit more complicated than just having enough skill points in the speech tree. Here you actually have to know what this character might like or not like. And you can see we have a certain number of persuasion points to spend as well, so it seems like these numbers next to each option are the point cost of using that option. Backgrounds are one of the things I'm really curious about in Starfield. Basically all of the gameplay of them thus far has been in the early game, so I do wonder how far reaching these dialogue options actually are, or if backgrounds are going to end up like life paths from Cyberpunk. But then of course we also have traits. Traits are options you don't have to take if you don't want to, but if you want to, you can pick up to 3 traits in total, and you can even remove them after you start playing. The traits we see here are largely the same we saw in 2022. Raise Enlightened or Universal are going to be the opposing religion traits. It gives you the ability to access your religion's chest full of items, but you cannot access the other religion's chest. One aspect of this that is interesting is both of these religions are going to be based in New Atlantis. There's definitely going to be some wild side quests tying them together. There's also Serpent's Embrace, which we talked about earlier, and we can see this trait will even open up some additional dialogue options as we encounter members of that religion. This will likely apply to the other religions as well, but we can also see our ship has some serious zoom. This Varun Him is 738 meters away, which is nearly a half mile away from us. As well as we can see in passing that we are progressing a quest with this, giving us one of the first looks at the new quest UI. There's going to be a variety of location-based traits like Neon Street Rat. You grew up on Neon, so you get special dialogue, better rewards from Neon quests, but the bounty you get from other factions will be increased. This is interesting because we saw how Neon was in the Freestar Collective space, so you can become wanted by the Freestar Collective even more easily despite growing up in Neon. That's kind of an interesting dichotomy. Kid Stuff is the parents trait. You have parents with a home, but you have to give them 2% of your earnings. There's going to be an introvert and extrovert trait. Introvert lets you use less oxygen, aka stamina, when adventuring alone, but when you have a companion, you'll use more oxygen. Extrovert is basically going to be the opposite effect. Hero Worshipped is the adoring fan trait, and he could even join your ship's crew and give you gifts. The only downside is he will just show up whenever he wants. We could also see some of the skills the adoring fan has as they're a member of your crew, but more on that later in this video. As I mentioned earlier, you can remove traits as well, and it seems like at least for Hero Worship, the way to do that is simply to kill your fan and remove the trait. Wanted basically seems like Bloodied. Low health leads to more damage, but occasionally bounty hunters will randomly come and try to take you out. Here we can see as we shoot the bounty hunters, they have far more of a reaction in their movements and flinching, being a better example of the updated combat system, but then we cut over to skills more explicitly, and in this clip we see a new planet with Nirvana 2 and a new enemy with the hunting cephalopod. I actually really like this out-of-water squid enemy, but what I found more interesting is this weapon. It looks like a rifle variant of the Grendel SMG, this rifle being known as the Beowulf. And the player is in God mode here, as our ammo does not decrease with each shot, considering we're only level 9 and fighting a level 45 cephalopod who is taking barely any damage per shot. I bet Bethesda just spawned in a high-level enemy to guarantee a level up and then left God mode on, otherwise this enemy would obliterate us. And you can even see us being way above our carry weight capacity in the menu, and another cool little detail is that depending on which faction the quest is tied to, you get a different icon in the menu. Earlier on, we saw a Constellation logo, and this here looks like a Crimson Fleet quest, so we get a Crimson Fleet logo next to it. But with each level up, you'll unlock a skill point that you could spend, and it's described how these can be spent to unlock or rank up skills. The skill system in Starfield is definitely more complex compared to past games. There's going to be 5 major categories of physical, social, combat, science, and tech. And these are broken up into tiers. You must spend a certain number of skills in a previous category in order to unlock access to the next one. Like here, you can see we must spend 2 more points in tech to unlock the ability to get more advanced tech skills. But even further, unlocking skills is more complicated now. The first level is straightforward, you just spend a skill point to get the benefits, but the second level is locked as you basically need to complete this challenge in order to open up the ability for you to spend another point and unlock level 2, 3, or 4. So though there is a challenge you have to do, the challenge being completed doesn't automatically level you up, it just gives you the opportunity to level up. So basically the way it works is spend a skill point to unlock a skill, then after that you complete the challenge and you could spend another skill point to start leveling up that skill and continue the process with each individual level after the first one. A really cool detail of this is the skill patch will get more detailed as you level it up more and more. Rank 1 brings color compared to when the skill is still locked, rank 2 gets a bit more detail, rank 3 gets a nice gold trim on the patch, and even rank 4 makes the skill art expand beyond the patch's area. And with each level up, the art itself is evolving. I think Bethesda did a really nice job with these skills, and honestly they'll probably make a ton of money selling them as patches if they want to. And here we are unlocking the security, otherwise known as the lockpicking or hacking skill. The first level gives you the ability to attempt to hack advanced locks, and you can store 2 auto attempts at a time. It seems like in Starfield, lockpicking and hacking are really just in one. The system by which you do this is pretty interesting. You look through this scope-like device to see the lock and then actually try and bypass it by fitting the segments into the gapped ring. It's basically just a puzzle. You have to fill in the gaps to complete the lock. And it seems like over time, you're going to gradually build progress towards auto slots, which likely just automatically puts in the next digipick for you. And a really nice feature is there's even an undo button at the bottom. Also, throwback, this lockpicking scene is on Crete, and you could even see predictable written on the whiteboard in all caps. This likely being connected to the monster we encounter on Crete as we saw in the first gameplay. We get some gameplay of the Xenosociology skill, which is going to allow us to mind control aliens. There's even a more human counterpart with Instigation, which gives you the ability to force enemies to attack their allies. But here we scan this hunting thorn mantis and we can see it's only 25% scanned, which is interesting. It seems like to get a creature fully scanned, and this applies to plants also, you can't just find one. You actually have to find multiple and scan each of them. It's not really clear if these have to be different variants or anything like that, but it definitely seems like it takes more than one example of that creature to get it fully scanned to 100%. We can see how this creature's temperament is fearless. It's not clear how many creatures Starfield will have, but you have to imagine it's going to be quite a few, and I don't think it'll be like past games where you just know how everything reacts. Like yeah, if you see a Deathclaw, you know, okay, big, scary, bad guy. But in Starfield, as you jump around to different planets, and a lot of planets that you're visiting for one time only, some creatures may look really scary, but actually be incredibly passive, and scanning them will definitely help inform you of that. But as you actually go to use the skill, we can see a percentage success rate and several options of what we can do to them. Boost Pack is some kind of jetpack buff. It's not actually entirely clear what this does, despite getting a special spotlight during the direct. We don't really use the jetpack all that much here, but it still drains our boost relatively rapidly. So perhaps this is making it so you could use your jetpack a bit longer, but it doesn't look like you'll be able to use your jetpack for that long anyway. But this little gameplay clip on Jemison is, in my opinion, one of the best looking gameplay clips we have of Starfield thus far. It just looks stunning here. Neurostrike is some punching skill, but another one that I'm not entirely sure what it does. Perhaps some kind of empowered punch that you can use periodically. It seems like martial arts is the typical unarmed damage booster skill, so just a percentage bonus to your damage output. So perhaps Neurostrike is going to be some powered final punch that deals extra damage once you charge it up with enough regular punches, or at least that's my speculation. Each enemy in this gameplay clip actually has a little blue bar slowly filling up over their head. It only appears after a punch, and honestly, I have no idea what this is. Perhaps this is us charging up Neurostrike. It also looks like there may be some kind of skill that allows us to see enemies through walls here, but it's never really explained. A ton of other skills are briefly highlighted over, especially during some of the backgrounds. You could just see the brief descriptions, but a lot of them don't actually give you that much detail on what the skills actually do. Like with robotics, it's hard to tell based off this description, are we hacking robots and automated turrets, or are we able to build robots and automated turrets? It'd be a lot of guesswork, but we also do get to see a bit more sneaking gameplay. We're gonna look at this new status indicator, and it definitely seems like these black bars mean something as we see them moving and changing. My speculation right now is perhaps these black bars will gradually build based off enemy suspicion. So if enough suspicious things happen, even if you maintain being hidden, they'll just basically become alert automatically. But in this, we also get a preview of pickpocketing, which is now going to be a real-time process, which is kind of a big change. No more pause picking like past games anymore. The scene within a Mars base has a couple of interesting notes. The shotgun just looks awesome. It appears to be ballistic, but also incredibly futuristic looking. As well as we have another enemy with a tiered health bar, but this time it definitely seems like we deal enough damage to just blast through the health regen completely and nearly one-shot this enemy. This death from above scene is quite fun, and it definitely is our first look at mines in action, but it's also pretty interesting to see some of the foliage LOD. We can see most of the grass seems to disappear during combat, although I don't want to focus on this too much because of course we're looking at an early build. It definitely seems like throughout the gameplay you can notice little things being turned down or tuned down to maintain a certain FPS. We get a rapid fire of combat scenes here showing off different weapons and a bunch of different enemies, like this launcher of some kind that just absolutely obliterates a pirate. There's this lever action launcher that looks awesome. You can even see the size of the projectile being loaded into it, and this is probably one of my favorite weapons we've seen during the Direct. And in what appears to be our first instance of some scoped gameplay, we can see that the full fade to black scopes are back, with the scope occupying your entire screen. As well as here, we actually land a crit on this enemy. This is the first time we see this as well, and I honestly have no idea why a crit was triggered. It could just be a random chance with some of the weapons, or perhaps tied to some of your skills, but I didn't notice any crit meters being filled or anything like that. In some of the other gameplay, the crosshair sometimes changes to an almost orange color, and I think that represents hitting a weak spot, like a headshot or even the jetpack. The scene's epic overall, but I feel like if you're watching it in real time, it's almost easy to miss what's going on fully. The first enemy we shoot has his jetpack fire off, and they're just flying about in the background, until as the gameplay continues, you eventually see that enemy explode. Visible holster weapons are one of those things I was tracking throughout this video, and I'm honestly a bit confused on it. If you're not familiar, this is a feature of some of the older Bethesda Game Studios games. When you holster your weapon, it'll appear on your hip or on your back. But in the Starfield gameplay, it sometimes appears and then sometimes doesn't. I'm honestly not entirely sure why. They describe here how planets in Starfield do have several considerations to make them feel real. Biomes are going to be placed on planets based on sun distance, and even atmospheres accounted for when it comes to weathers. As well as we continue to see a wide array of different features. Outside of me just describing the physical appearance of these creatures, there really isn't much else for me to say. We get a brief shot of some space combat against a Crimson Fleet Spectre that looks giant compared to us. But I'll wait for the real space section to fully break this down. But one cool aspect that's mentioned here is you will have the ability to explore derelict ships. So it seems like in Starfield, there'll sometimes just be broken or damaged ships floating about. You could dock onto them and explore, probably finding some loot, and it just seems like this will be a great way to hide Easter eggs in the game. Outside of just highlighting stunning visuals, most of these HUD-less shots are pretty straightforward without much to break down. But this shot that looks to be in neon has the detail of nets being placed above you. Typically something like this would be to catch jumpers, and it being present in neon definitely gives it a dark undertone. We have a cutscene of several ships landing, and this is another pretty cool real game moment, at least I think. I believe this ship landing visual is what you'll actually see as you land at spaceports. I imagine it's going to be skippable though, and I really love this perspective because it gives you a preview of the customization options we will have. Frontier looks miniature compared to this giant cargo freighter, and even just the wide array of different console styles we will have, which almost looks like they are designed around different types of function. Some like they're geared towards combat, and some others just towards cruising around space with all of your cargo. But our ship in Starfield is described as another character and home that we will have. This first shot is a genuinely interesting one, as this is a ship vendor. We have an opportunity to buy this ship, Celestial 2, for 391,000 credits, which is about double the credits we actually have on us. And we can see how this vendor is selling 6 ships in total. We have heard how ships in Starfield will be something you can build or buy, but also how they are really expensive, and it's going to be more of something you grow into over the the course of the game and really extend into in the late game. This price tag of several 100,000 credits definitely reflects that it's probably a late game item. We also get a nice preview of the major stats of the ship. We can see the major ship systems as well as their stats at the top. We'll dive deeper into that in a moment, but an interesting note, as the ships are cycled through, you can see ship systems disappear depending on how it is equipped. Like this ship has no ballistic weapon, so that option disappears. Beyond that, fuel, hull HP, and cargo capacity seem to be the major ship stats you'll care about. Fuel is not going to refer to the fuel needed while just flying around, but the fuel you'll need while jumping. And below you can see the jump range of this ship. Hull is going to be the ship's overall health, and cargo capacity is pretty self-explanatory. Shielded capacity appears below it, and it seems like these ships have 0. I suspect this is going to be how we can smuggle items into certain areas when we have to go through a contraband check. Your shielded capacity may be where you're able to hide certain things if you actually have some, but from there we have other ship stats. We get a nice comparison to our current ship to see what is better or worse. Most of these are pretty self-explanatory, but the bottom is our look at the major weapon options of ships. So we have ballistic, particle beam, which is good against multiple targets at once, and lasers, which is going to be the main method of firing on enemies. But one of the other pretty cool parts about this is I believe Bethesda brought us to a black market dealer, as each of these ships are unregistered. We heard how ships will need to be registered to modify them, and this is basically Bethesda's way of gamifying piracy in Starfield. So yeah, you can go out and steal some high-end ship by just taking out all of the enemies, but you'll need to register it to fully unlock its abilities. As of right now, we just really know that to fully modify a ship, to start editing its parts, you'll need to register it, but likely there's other components as well. And I'm sure whatever the price of registering your ship is, it'll be pretty expensive, especially for higher end ships. So seemingly this vendor selling us unregistered ships means we can't actually modify them, but it's also likely some kind of black market vendor, where maybe a bunch of these ships are actually stolen from various factions and the prices are a bit cheaper, but we could probably sell our own stolen ships here as well. We get a look at the ship editor here as we add some more cargo space. Fun note, the command deck portion of this ship was shown as concept art just before. It's pretty cool to be able to see the early on concept art versus the relatively final product of the ship, but also there's just a lot of really nice options in the ship editor. The reactor seems to be the main power source. Our reactor has 27 power and we can distribute those points into the various ship subsystems. Except it's a bit more complicated than that because we have 30 points distributed here. It seems like that's what equip power is, so perhaps this is a problem. We are overpowering for our reactor right now. There's an error alert in the bottom right, so perhaps this is triggering the error. We're just drawing too much power. There are also some handy options to delete or flip the object we are placing, and after it is placed, a ton of additional options appear, like undo and redo, which is going to be a godsend if you really get into this shipbuilding system, but also options to duplicate certain parts and even a flight check to see how your new build actually feels when you're flying it. And off to the side, there is a height option to adjust what level certain ship parts are on, but you can see some other options at the bottom like mobility, which is likely the maneuverability of your ship, but there's other options like top speed there as well. The rest of the stats are familiar ones we saw before and pretty straightforward, like crew capacity or even the jump range of a ship. It also appears that all of this is actually happening at the exact same vendor we were browsing before. The credits have been the same, and you can see as we attach parts to the ship, we almost have a cart as our floating total cost would change. Although it doesn't actually seem to be changing for some reason in this gameplay. We can also see attaching a landing bay, which is an interesting concept. I wonder if you could have multiple landing bays and in turn, multiple points of entry for your spaceship. We see our hired crew hard at work within the ship, and we get some nice animations from them actually interacting with the various consoles and ship systems. We get a look at our friendly space technician here. Every spaceport has one of these guys, and they're going to sell ships, ship parts, but also can repair and modify your ship for you. But then there's also that option to sell some ships of our own, which is pretty handy. On this shot of Frontier, we get a nice view of 821393, that being the patent number for the Wright brothers flying machine, a nice little reference. We jump into the ship editor here, and this is seemingly just the modify option. So it's almost like we're looking at our own garage with our ship. We can see Frontier is our only ship and listed as the home ship. I really have no idea what this means, but it just likely means it's our primary spacecraft right now. We know you could have multiple ships at once, but I wonder if you could also have multiple ships deployed at once, like stationed in various areas for different purposes. Can you fast travel from one ship to another across the galaxy? Frontier is way over on cargo capacity here, and we can see options to enter into the shipbuilder, which opens up the full shipbuilder, where you edit and take apart everything. And during this, we get a preview of how parts will have several different variants. or upgrade our ship, which is almost like a streamlined option to building a ship. It seems like this gives you a simpler way of just upgrading one part at a time and replacing it, rather than having to redesign your entire ship as you try and build it out. We can see several weapon options here with some relevant stats like their range and even fire rate, but there are also specific stats for damage dealt versus enemy shields or a hull. I can already imagine some build videos around this. Is it better to prioritize damage to the hull or the shields? I bet the United Colonies have crazy strong shields, but perhaps the Freestar Collective have stronger hulls. Bethesda saved me a ton of effort here by just breaking down the direct for us, and you can see all of the various parts of the ship you can edit. The weapons are interesting to me, as you can see lasers, then particle weapons, and finally ballistic missiles. And most of the other things are pretty straightforward except the grav drive. This is going to be what allows us to jump through space. We actually heard about this spooling up all the way back in the 2021 trailer. We've known about this stuff for a while now. And even beyond that, there's still numerous color customization options with your spaceship in every part of it, along with a preview of some of the interior customization options. In Starfield, ship interiors can be customized somewhat, but it seems like a lot of this is just which parts you choose for the exterior will impact what is reflected on the interior. But it is also described how certain companies will have their own unique look and feel when it comes to ship parts, so you may end up liking one company or one manufacturer or another. From there, we basically just get a montage of the sheer range of customization options. This truly seems epic. I'm ready for the day one Thomas the Tank Engine ships in Starfield, but it really feels like you're going to be able to make largely whatever you want. And one of the big takeaways I had from this is it seems like you have a lot of opportunities with height. It seems like ships are somewhat limited in how long and wide they can be. Like some of the ships here are really pushing the limit on length, but it seems like these things can be freaking tall. So if you have the credits, you can likely build some very dense ships and really have some freighters traveling throughout space. Here we're going to look at some of the major companion options in Starfield. Companions can be a part of the crew of your spaceship or even just work at your outpost. And the scene of Sarah Morgan in front of the fire is just stunning. It looks ridiculously high quality. There are 4 major companions in Starfield, and we get previews of them here, including which skills they're going to be particularly good at. Notice how companions seem to have 4 skill proficiencies, while the other NPCs that you can get on your crew only have 3 or even less. Sarah Morgan is probably the most notable as she is a part of Constellation. Sam Coe definitely seems like a Freestar Collective member, and we've seen him several times in the Direct. Barrett is the one who introduces us to Constellation in the first place, and seemingly they kept one companion hidden. There of course is Vasco, but we know there's going to be 4 major romance options for companions, and it doesn't seem like Vasco is one of them. So there's one more companion out there, but even beyond that, companions are going to have their very own quest lines in Starfield. And beyond the 4 major ones, there's also just crew, which almost seem to function like companions light. We can hire crew from spaceports. As we approach this viewport, you can see this lady just sitting here, and I wouldn't be shocked if there's just always people hanging out here, almost Mountain Blade style. There's little shops you'll be able to find crew members and recruit them consistently. And this other crew member is found in the world, and this seems like a really cool scenario. Like this person crash landed on this moon and is just stranded. We see their smoking ship and some settlements in the distance, so we can hire Heller, who has only 2 proficiencies, but it still seems pretty strong. And then we get the big menu, the menu that many of us are going to spend a lot of our lives within. This is where you're going to be able to assign companions, crew members, or even robots like a security mini-bot to our ships or outposts. You can see when unassigned, crew and companions will just hang out somewhere like a Crimson Fleet outpost or the Lodge. Although that is kind of curious, why is Barrett of Constellation hanging out a Crimson Fleet outpost? It seems like that would be something Constellation members wouldn't be doing. So the skills one of your crew members have will affect how your outpost and ships are run. It'll probably boost the stats of those things depending on which skill it is. But it seems like only some skills will apply. You can see how on this list only certain skills are actually highlighted, which are likely the skills that are applying and relevant to their current task. Like for example, Sam Coe's on our spaceship, so only his piloting and payload skills are being utilized, while rifle and geology are not. Conversely, if we assigned him to an outpost, it likely would be rifles and geology that are applying, and his other piloting and ship-based skills would not. So depending on what skills and really what proficiencies certain crew members have, you should be assigning them to one location or another. We finally get to see some Vasco combat, which pleases me. His little circular device turns into a laser weapon, although throughout the Direct, Vasco largely looks the same as far as I can tell, so I haven't seen any evidence of robot customizability in Starfield, as well as you have Vasco punching a robot dog to protect us. How can you not love this guy? But then we transition to the real purpose of all of this, space exploration and combat. We get some panning shots of spaceflight, and we can once again see how much activity there is from other spacecraft around some of the major planets in Starfield. We get a look at us in the cockpit, and you can actually see your character flying the ship, which is pretty cool. It'll be awesome if you could actually see your character flying the ship while in photo mode. That floating space station in the background definitely feels like a nod to the space station we saw in Interstellar. But then we got to a sequence of us activating our grav drive and jumping through space. This is a cool little detail, as you have to imagine this is something you will actually see your character do as you prepare to jump. But then we cut to some proper ship combat, and quite a bit is shown on screen during this. We are locked onto a spacer raccoon, using both our ballistic weapons and our lasers to damage them. And it seems like these weapons are using an almost overheat/reload system. As you fire, you see the numbers and the little white bars draining, but it seems like you do have unlimited ammo. No ammo capacity is listed anywhere, so likely after this reaches 0, you will just have to wait a short duration for the cooldown and then things will reload automatically. The lock-on mechanic is interesting, as it does appear that most of our shots will just magically track to the enemy as long as you maintain a lock on them. There's no real manual aiming that I could see. It's largely just keeping the enemy in this giant circle and you'll be relatively successful. But seemingly the ship is also equipped with some electromagnetic weapons. We're not actively using them, but we get a nice preview of how this will work on a controller, at least from a control perspective. The two major weapon systems are bound to your triggers, and it almost looks like the special weapon is going to be the Y key, whether that be missiles or here the electromagnetic weapons. And as our shots land, we can see the shield draining, while the bottom white bar seems to be the hull's HP of that enemy ship. Beyond that, we of course can set our speed, but ships will also have boost functionality to get around a bit quicker in a pinch. And a pretty cool detail, as you actually maneuver your ship around and actually use some of the different thrusters on the ship, you can see it somewhat reflected in the console. Most of this is happening on the right display, as things will dynamically update as you move around. Starfield will feature a faster than light style energy allocation system where you basically have to distribute power points into the various ship subsystems, and in doing so those systems will become more powerful, more power to the engines, and we're going to fly faster. With 1 point in the engine we're going 24, but with 6 points in we get all the way up to 149. And on this other scene we can see how we have missiles equipped to our Y activator now. If you add more power to the grav drive you can initiate jumps faster. Lots of information is shared in this one too. It appears we are reversing our spaceship here, based at least on the speed indicator, but we also seem to be tracking an ecliptic stiletto, but other enemies have a missile locked onto us at the same time. And upon that missile and several other attacks hitting, we can see our shield go offline and our hull starts to take damage. Despite how large the shield graphic is over on the right side of your screen, it doesn't actually seem to relay any information outside of your shield and hull health. For how much space this takes up, I thought as the shield starts taking impacts it would actually be reflected here, but no, it just kind of sits there looking the same with the number changing. But of course, we finally do a grav jump to get out of this situation, so it is nice to know grav jumping is a viable way to escape combat encounters. And we have a rare scene from the Direct here where somebody is actually playing with a keyboard and mouse. But then of course, there are also options to add power to our weapons and shields. We could see how adding power to our shields, the value goes from 20 at 1 point of power to 60 at 3 points of power. And we even get to see another enemy jumping into our space, which is pretty awesome. You can see the space warping around him, and almost immediately we could hear them on our comms. One design choice they seemingly have made with Starfield is as you near other ships, you automatically connect to their microphones or radios. As this Crimson Fleet pirate flies in, we can immediately hear them talking, and even a bit earlier, as we destroyed a ship, we heard the inhabitants scream in horror. But with this Crimson Fleet haunt, you can see after they jump in, their shields charge up, and I think this is actually a pretty cool reflection that other NPCs will also have to use this power allocation system just like us. So basically, the haunt is moving a bunch of points from its grav drive to its shields. This is happening right as it lands, so we can see the shield slowly build up just like ours did earlier. And as soon as the haunt is within our giant circle, the locking process begins, and shortly thereafter we are locked onto the enemy. But as soon as they fly away, we lose our lock, and then we must track them and begin the process again. So you can start to see how this system is balanced. Yeah, you do have a giant circle by which lock-ons can happen, but a halfway decent enemy can maneuver around that. And it is described how there's a specific specific skill where you can target ship subsystems. This is where that giant target lock X has been in the middle of the screen. After you hit this, you'll zoom way in and you could actually target specific ship parts with your weapons. So you'll basically be using the energy allotment tool to actually choose where you're targeting, whether that be the grav, drive, weapon, shields, or something else. I do wonder if this is some automated tracking system. Being this zoomed in and still flying, it seems like it'd be very hard to maneuver and actually track a ship successfully, so maybe the game helps you out a bit or a little bit of autopilot kicks in here. And in the follow-up gameplay, we could see finally we use one of our top-mounted missiles to target the ship. Destroying enemy ships is going to yield both loot and scrap, but after destroying a ship's engine, you will also have the ability to dock on that ship, which is pretty cool. The boarding visual has been seen a few times, and this too is what I believe will play in game as you actually go through this process. So you'll probably see this exact boarding sequence play out in game. And it seems like we may have damaged the ship enough for the artificial gravity to stop working as well. But in the end, you can fully take out the crew and take that ship for yourself. As we pilot the ship, we can see a repair option on the side for our damaged hull. So there's likely going to be some kind of item or something you can use to field repair your spaceship. You don't only have to return to spaceports. And we get a preview here of several faction ships. First, 2 ships for the Freestar Collective that we have captured. I definitely follow their general aesthetic, but also some sleeker options for the Ecliptic Mercenaries. Not much is known about this faction outside of them just kind of being a general bad guy faction, almost like the Gunners from Fallout 4. And I gotta say, some of the Ecliptic ships look really cool here. We then pull up to what is referred to as a star yard, and we can see from the interior shots, this is specifically a United Colony star yard. And as you explore the station, you can see absolutely stunning views of space. These are the moments I'm excited for, just floating around in space on a station and taking in the visuals around you. We talked to someone here who seems to offer to sell or give us a ship, and they appear to be Maury, sporting the iconic face tattoo. One thing I am pretty happy to see in Starfield is the premier factions will have premier ships that we can dock with, like the UC Vigilance here, that's sporting a 5-ship deep escort. As we dock, we have options to dock or hail with this ship, but it almost seems like we also have them locked, so I imagine you could attempt to fight the fleet if you wanted to. I wonder how badly that would go for us. Docking we see, but hailing would just open the dialogue options as we've seen in some of the other gameplay. But also just parties. We see a massive space cruise ship pass by and you can dock with it. On here we find a Terran Preservation Society party, and we even get some fancy clothes to attend the party. Terran basically just means to preserve Earth, so this is a faction or a group that wants to preserve Earth, likely some of the things that were previously on Earth due to the state Earth currently is in, and apparently they're throwing space parties to commemorate that. As we hail a variety of ships, we see options to engage in some space piracy things, then cut to some combat, but I imagine this is going to be a variable. Depending on how menacing your ship is, or even based on your skills, some ships will likely just give in to your demands without a fight. Sandwiches in Starfield seem to consist of white bread, lettuce, American cheese, and some salami. And if you are concerned, collecting and stacking junk items seems like it'll remain in the game. We had a brief look at the hulking space station that looks epic. I have no idea what the giant center black hole is, but it definitely establishes a presence. And we meet up with a grandma, perhaps our grandma? Many people immediately speculated this was Shirley Curry, aka the Skyrim grandma. And although she is supposed to be in the Elder Scrolls 6, it is confirmed that this is not her in Starfield. If anything, based off the dialogue, I wouldn't be shocked if this is a scam, if grandma is going to invite us on and then perhaps take a kidney or two. Here we have another epic shot of us walking through a glass enclosure. We can see ships flying by, as well as our visible holstered weapons coming out once again. But then we're aboard a Deimos armored transport, which makes me think perhaps Deimos is a company contracted or associated with UC. But further, we can seemingly see the artificial gravity generator fail here, and gravity turns off. This is likely connected to some kind of side quest, because this exact scenario is described by Todd Howard in a recent interview. As you explore the ship, the gravity will basically be spotty, occasionally kicking back in, but then turning off, which creates this really interesting dynamic with combat. We get some specific location previews as well, a horrifying hive for some creatures we see walking past, and I just gotta say no to basically everything about this place. Then some eccentric characters. This guy seems to have quite the home with a giant bronze statue of what I presume is a Greek soldier. Take note of the extensive defense systems that are installed here, though. It's definitely not a statue we're going to be able to steal. And in this shot, we could even see some guards stationed. And then we have a man in a suit and someone dressed like Cleopatra for some reason. The drill behind them definitely makes this encounter a bit more curious, and I imagine these are both just some interesting side quests or weird characters we'll find in this world, including the ECS Constant. The inhabitants of the ship describe thinking they were the only ones to leave Earth. and genuinely believed that we were an alien that requested to dock with them. And you can even notice the guards are armed with their weapons drawn as we walk in. You can see this ship was prepared to sustain life, and an interesting aspect of this is we have no idea how long this ship has been drifting around in space. Earth seems largely destroyed, but we don't actually know when that happened. These might be second or even third or fourth generation inhabitants of this spaceship that have just been floating around, not realizing there's tons of other people and colonies out there. Space random encounters are going to be a feature of Starfield as well. As you pull up next to a party cruise with the option to join on in, random encounters are a staple of past Bethesda Game Studios games, where sometimes when exploring you walk to a point and something random can spawn. This could be something like fighting enemies, some oddity, or even just pipe. We have some nice panning shots of traveling to various planets and even highlighting the planets themselves, but we've largely broken down this info already. The planet of Kazal having water as biological is interesting, as perhaps this means we could have some sea creatures in Starfield. That's not something we've really seen thus far. We could see that Arcturus 3 has been fully surveyed and now sports the Constellation colors, which reveals that surveys are likely going to be done for Constellation as a faction. Nira has some interesting map markers with a gravity farm and a pharma lab. Honestly, I have no idea how a gravity farm could even work, but seeing that on a map would definitely make me want to land and investigate there. We get even more gameplay on Parima 4, where you encounter some unexplained biological feature. This is interesting, as even after scanning it, we don't know what this is, so perhaps some other knowledge of the planet needs to be gained to fully understand what's going on here. A lot of the scanning stuff seems like it has multiple levels to it, and we're really only seeing the highest and surface view version of that in the Direct. We get some more ship combat gameplay, but this scene's particularly interesting. It's been highlighted as either being a bug or a really cool feature. We're fighting the Freestar Collective here, but interestingly, one of the ships is a United Colonies dagger sporting the Freestar Collective logo, and considering we could see UC ships in the distance that are either on our side or at least passive to us, it very much so seems like there is a United Colony ship being piloted by the Freestar Collective here. So, did this faction capture the enemy ship and is actually repurposing it for themselves, or is this just a bug with the naming? It seems like we're right outside New Atlantis, and if that's really a feature where you do have other factions repurposing ships, just like what happened in real life during the naval era, that'd be awesome. I'd love to see that as a feature in Starfield. This scene here is just epic. Actual Star Wars-like space battles in Starfield with tons of ships and lasers flying everywhere. This time we're fighting against the Crimson Fleet pirates though. Although, based off our shield not faltering, it definitely seems like Bethesda Game Studios is using God mode to survive this onslaught. As you approach this Crimson Fleet White, its hull is heavily damaged, but its shields are still recharging, which suggests that shields can recharge. Perhaps we broke through the ship's shields once, but something happened or they just maneuvered away from us and their shields are now regenerating back up. And we get this epic shot of finishing off that ship, who is a very damaged grav drive with a rocket. And for some further proof that Barrett is in fact our introduction into Constellation, we can see him handing us our watch and notice how the left side of the HUD is empty during the scene. Seems like the watch is giving us the left side of our HUD. I'm not going to break down all of the watch and controller stuff because a lot of it just comes down to aesthetics. Do you find this visually pleasing? Yes/no. We get some more panning shots of the absolutely beautiful landscapes in Starfield. But the one to stand out to me was on this screen in the background. Look at how just lush and green this scenery seems. It looks stunning. We get a look at this awesome double-barrel shotgun and a ship taking off that almost looks like an ecliptic mercenary ship. This is a really cool moment. You can see the ship thruster switch from shooting down to the side as it propels itself away. And you can even see a bunch of enemies pop up on the compass as they fly away. So maybe we were just seeing some bad guys fly off the planet, but could this be some cool mechanic where enemies can actually retreat from you in their spaceship? Our health is under 100%, so it could suggest that we just walked away from a fight with these guys. But then we take a look at the Narayan system, controlled by the Freestar Collective, who we happen to have a 12,000 credit bounty with. This is a really handy resource visualization tool. Resources are described as being used for building, crafting, and customizing, and later on in the gameplay we'll even see that research requires resources. The visualization seems like a straightforward way to choose a landing spot and potentially even outpost location depending on which resources you need, although this is likely only the common and abundant resources. Notice how only some of the resources have colored icons. Perhaps the non-colored ones cannot be easily found on the map, and you need to actually find these on foot, likely because they're more valuable or more rare. Planets in Starfield are going to be a mix of handcrafted and procedurally generated content, and we can see that on display here. Planets themselves are largely procedural, but as you explore, structural locations are generated for you, and these are going to largely be handcrafted. It seems seems like this will be a large expansion of the random encounter system, where there's basically going to be a large catalog of handcrafted things that could spawn in a certain location. So while for you in this location, an abandoned robotics facility was placed, perhaps for your friend, when they go to the same location, it's going to be a science outpost instead. The two even have the same map marker, which perhaps reflects that this is a random encounter location, and that's what this map marker means. Later on in the Direct, we can see two different structures in the same exact location, suggesting that there is a lot of variability in what could spawn here. As well as on top of that, the world will be populated by creatures and plants that do seem to be largely handcrafted. As we approach this geophysical feature, we can see how scanning it will give us info on a geophysics trait. Not entirely sure what that is, but maybe it's related to the magic systems we'll be talking about shortly. And this is really elevated, as we get a quest to clear out some aggressive animals from a local habitat, which just screams Radiant Quest. So it seems like these randomly generated structures will give you things to do beyond just taking down enemies at them or trying to loot them. But at the deserted robotics lab, we get a look at the sandstorm going on. Various types of weather seem like it'll be a major feature of Starfield. It wasn't explored too extensively in the Direct, but you have to imagine with all of these different planets, all of these different atmospheres, and even all of the different terrain types, you're really going to have quite a range of options as far as weathers you'll encounter. And as you watch the gameplay of clearing out all of these enemies, just remember, this is dynamically placed. The game placed this structure here at random, which I think makes consuming this gameplay a lot more interesting, as well as I think we also see the best example of the jetpack explosion mechanic thus far in the gameplay. It seems like a bug snuck through as we go to stop aiming our weapon and it'll magically transition to being lowered. We see this pirate with some extra designs on their rank, likely indicating that they're the boss enemy, or perhaps will even drop more loot. That's a feature in Fallout 76. You'll sometimes get these enemies with a unique insignia on them, but when you take them out, they'll actually drop a greater degree or higher tier loot compared to the rest. We fire 2 shots from the coachman, but they cut the ammo ejection. The coachman was that shotgun from last year's gameplay that ejected bullets, leading to a lot of criticism from fans. It's a shotgun. Why is it ejecting bullets, and why are the casings fully intact? So though this cut could have just been random, it definitely feels deliberate. I wonder if Bethesda actually fixed that problem or if it's still here in the game. But Starfield will also have some old weapons, like an M1911, meaning that this design is now over 400 years old by the time of Starfield. But don't worry, we're going to have some futuristic space pistols as well. And as we go to loot that enemy, armor is still not lootable, but at this garbage we find what perhaps is a special or legendary item, featuring 3 stars as well as 3 unique effects on it. So this helmet is going to reduce damage from robots, allow you to store more auto lockpicking attempts, and give you a 10% chance to light enemies on fire. And in particular, having your armor actually give you bonus damage to weapons is a pretty unique and interesting stat that they haven't explored too much in past games. Throughout the Direct, we see a wider range of jetpacks and other backpacks, and I do wonder how much of a functional difference there's going to be. Is it mostly just carry weight bonuses, or will some jetpacks last significantly longer, allow you to fly significantly further? Here we have what looks like some passive creatures warning us not to approach any closer. Back on Parima 4, you can see what looks like another randomly generated location that's very close to what could be a handcrafted location. It almost looks like our spaceship may be parked nearby as well. But then we get into the other aspect that some of you are going to be spending thousands of hours on, the scanning and outpost building components of the Direct. And for me, this is one of the parts of the Direct I was looking forward to the most. I was really curious to see what else they had in store for these systems. The scanner is going to be a quick access option that we're able to activate at any time, and this is the hub with a ton of other options. Things like photo mode, which we'll see more of later on, but also placing outposts and just zooming in and scanning things. While you have the scanner open, your HUD's going to change quite dramatically. You'll have information like temperature, oxygen level, and gravity level coming into play. But you have to imagine this will be something you quickly check whenever you land on new places, especially the gravity level, as that seems like it'll have a fairly large impact on your gameplay. The scanner will also automatically equip your cutter laser. This is going to be what you use to mine resources. And we can see how to fully survey this planet, we need to fully scan 8 resources, 7 creatures or fauna, and 5 plants or flora. But then also uncover the 2 traits of this planet. But as we scan things, we can see the meter only partially fills, making it seem like you will need to scan things multiple times and perhaps even multiple variants to hit that 100% marker. Although we do this in the gameplay shortly thereafter. And with each subsequent scan of a creature, you can see more information is revealed about it. It is described how with certain skills you can create an outposts and produce resources from certain plants and animals. So it almost sounds like there might be some kind of taming or creature management mechanic, as well as, of course, you will be able to grow your own plants. We see different animals scanned and they have different icons next to their name. I honestly have no idea what these icons are going to correspond to. All of these animals have the same temperament, but different icons, and two with the same icon have different resources associated with them. As well as you can see what resources will be dropped from animals like Sealant from this dragon, as well as this dragon has burning damage, so it may literally breathe fire, which is epic. As we go up to scan this ice creeper, we can see our character has a cough, which is going to obfuscate much of our HUD. We're in the scanner mode, but information like gravity and temperature isn't being shown to us, which is interesting. Diseases limiting some of your HUD-based information is kind of a weird mechanic that I feel like not many games have really explored. Perhaps we are getting diseases due to the local area. We could see what looks like a toxic valley with some toxic plants right in front of us. In this next scene, we scan a hive structure. It seems we need to scan 3 of these in total, and this reveals the final unknown trait about the planet, the other trait being a gravitational anomaly. After discovering that trait, we get a fully surveyed indication for this planet. It's described how there are going to be bonuses for fully surveying planets and systems, and we heard in other interviews how you're going to be able to sell this survey data once you have it complete. We see another storm in action, and for me, this one gave major True Storms vibes. This is a mod for Fallout 4 that was incredibly popular. We get a preview of a bunch of different creatures in Starfield, and it feels like there's some genuine variety here. We see things that look like they're dinosaurs to just large bugs or even just other kinds of monsters wandering about. Starfield's going to calculate the sun's location and then the impacts of the atmosphere when determining how light lands on planets. We get some stunning shots of the environments in game, and you can really see the higher degree of detail compared to past Bethesda Game Studios titles. And with this, they describe wanting Starfield to feel more cinematic as you play it. Their visual goal here was more filmic, so almost like your visuals are going to feel more like a movie than a video game. As you go through each of these environmental shots, I'm reminded by the wide array of concept art we saw for Starfield. It seemed implausible that all of those different environments could be added in game, but no, they were, and we're seeing it right here. We have a ton of different environments, some of these being dramatically different. This shot of what looks like to be a busted open pipeline is pretty interesting. Not entirely sure what to make of it, but this seems to reveal that even on what looks like a relatively desolate and overgrown planet, there are still large things to find and stumble upon. And we finally get into placing down our own outpost, where we could start to see a few interesting things. Outpost beacons will get a nice little foundation to prop them up and make placement even easier. But also, what resources are around or under the outpost will be made immediately clear to you. It's described how these can be built almost anywhere, which makes sense with how barren many planets are going to be, but I do wonder how close you can actually build to some of the major cities. You have to imagine you can't really get all that close to New Atlantis, but thus far that stuff hasn't really been shown in gameplay. The Outpost HUD reveals a ton of new information. There's going to be options for build mode. You could either build in the first-person perspective like we are now, or jump into the freeform top-down view camera. But also there's major stats listed for outposts like cargo, crew, power levels, and production by the minute. I think this gives us a pretty clear message on the purpose of Outposts, that it's largely going to be for gathering resources. I'm sure you can just play The Sims to a degree here as well, build up something really pretty and cool, but in real gameplay terms, it really feels like you're going to be setting up outposts in specific areas to try and get the resources in that area. As we see some of the outpost modules built, we hear how we can, of course, live in these, but also we can see the USS Constitution placed down on a table, and another robot helper. This does not appear to be Vasco, but another robot we built or acquired somehow. The core of the resource generation seems to be these extractors, but crew and companions can work at outposts as well, as we saw a bit earlier. In the build menu, we can see there's going to be 12 different tabs of buildables, which feels like a lot, a healthy amount of different things to build, and the resources mostly being used here are aluminum, sealant, and lead. And some structures will have multiple variants, as you can see it on the menu. So certain structures will have a couple of different styles for you to choose from. There is going to be a build limit in Starfield though. We can see even this relatively small outpost, the build limit has a decent chunk missing. I'm sure these types of things will be modified as we approach release, so I don't want to comment on it too much, but just know there definitely is a limit. It doesn't seem like you could create a full-fledged sprawling city here, at least not without mods. And although it's never properly shown, we hear while you're on foot, you can really decorate things more precisely. So it sounds like you'll have a more focused settlement building mode, pretty similar to how it worked in past games while you're on foot with individual objects or even junk items. But then conversely, when you get into the top-down mode, you're really more building some of the structural assets of your settlement. And in the scene, we see a ton of interesting things. An armor and weapon display off to the side, some exercise equipment like a bench and heavy bag. You have to imagine using this for a certain amount of time will give your character some kind of temporary buff. Crossing in front front of us right now is the Moppin bot, which I want in real life. And even on the coffee table, it looks like we have another instance of the RV Calypso. In the next room, there is what looks like a Macintosh SE on the table. I do wonder if some of these unique props will be specific unlocks as a part of a quest, or even just secrets to find. Like maybe you find this Mac somewhere in a box on Earth, and once you successfully loot it, you'll be able to build it at settlements. We get a variety of panning shots of outposts in action. One of the exciting things we see here is a second landing pad placed down at this one. So we have multiple ships docked at one location. And in the next scene, we get a confirmation that indoor farming will be a thing. Although one thing I would love to see in Starfield is outdoor farming. If you find a planet with fertile soil and a decent atmosphere, it'd be cool to be able to create fairly sprawling farms, almost like what you could do in Fallout 4. Research is an interesting little twist up with Starfield, but I'm a pretty big fan of it. It almost seems like this is going to be the replacement for those perks that just unlock the ability for you to build things. So instead of you having to get the science and gun nut perk, you just research how to make certain weapon mods. Research is broken down into 5 major categories, with pharmacology, food and drink, outpost development, equipment, and weaponry. And as we can see, this is all going to be fairly straightforward, like researching barrel mods 1, and then after you finish that, it opens up the option to research barrel mods 2. And then of course that research actually unlocks the ability for you to apply barrel mods to some of your weapons. And we can see research is going to require resources, like this one requiring iron, nickel, and sealant. The weapon mod screen is going to be vastly overhauled. We can see this is happening at a weapons workbench, which are making a return, and there are quite a few mod slots to choose from. We see some new categories like an internal mod, but there are even further options that we can't see on screen here. We can change not only the magazine size, but also the type of ammo being used, but it seems like there's 2 separate options for this. Like you'd either stick with the typical ammo and then increase your magazine size, or you can use a different type of ammo, but then you're stuck with a reduced magazine size. But for this weapon, we could see ammo mods like armor-piercing explosive rounds, which we do equip, and even whiteout rounds, which I have no idea what those are, and even after doing some Googling, it doesn't seem like it's a real thing. We use a modified weapon against a Varun robot Model S, as we are doing a quest on Jemison. This robot is likely a reference to the Tesla Model S. We see some stealth gameplay with the suppressor, and we can see sneak attack bonuses, and that damage system is returning. Although funny enough, every sneak attack I spotted in the Direct actually does 2.1 times damage. 2.1 times feels like a very specific number. I'm not really sure if that's the default, or perhaps we have some skills boosting that up slightly. We get a look at the weapon inventory again, and this time we have one weapon that's glowing blue. This seems to be a 1-star legendary item, which in Starfield will be known as a rare weapon. It seems like instead of actually using stars and the legendary naming, it's just going to be rare and then likely some other tier for 2 stars and an even higher tier for 3 stars. But we also take some melee weapons into combat against a plant and some other enemies, and this enemy, which seems to be a member of the Ecliptic Mercenaries, but he's just titled Ecliptic, which is kind of a weird and ominous name, drops what appears to be a quest item with the Technician's Ground Crew pack. And this third-person combat really showcases the updated animation system again. I think these are some of the best animations we've seen from a Bethesda Game Studios game, and this is probably the best example we have of the new animations in the Direct. On Mars, we throw a futuristic-looking grenade at a spacer punk. And I'm sorry to out you like this, Bethesda, but that grenade completely missed the enemy. It literally dealt 0 damage. But then the shotgun comes in handy to one-shot this spacer. Another nice feature returning from past games, we see as this enemy is taken out, their primary weapon goes flying and we can loot it individually. So it seems like Starfield will have that system where you could loot weapons off of the body, or you can pick up the weapon directly from where it fell. This shot here is pretty awesome. We can see Starfield will feature destroyable freeze tanks of some kind that will immediately explode into a giant ice crystal and even freeze the people around it. This heavy weapon in the next shot positively melts enemies. It fired 17 rounds in a half second, and as the sights go over enemies, the dots will even turn red. This is going to be one of the new mag weapons. We'll talk more about it in a moment, but this thing just looks like an all-around great time. We get to look at a ton of weapons here, including some legendary or rare items. Brawlers is one of the legendary effects from a past game that's making a return, where you deal double damage when bashing an enemy with a weapon. Ember, some kind of laser pistol with ignition beams built in, and we can see there's going to be certain special ammo types for lasers. With how prevalent lasers have been, I imagine they might be a bit more complex than Fallout 4. Eternity's Gate has a wild design and the special effect of hand loading. It uses volatile rounds to increase damage, but they can occasionally fail on you. Experiment A7, which is a stellar name for a weapon, just has the exterminator effect, giving you more damage against aliens. Weapon naming in Starfield has always been pretty interesting to me. Almost every weapon weapon has like a name, like a person or a human name. A lot of the weapon names here sound like unique weapons, but it seems like that's just the standard variant. As well as we could see many of the interesting and well-designed weapons coming with this game, but also some of the pretty unique mods. This weapon has a thermal scope of some kind, and it seems to be the same effect we saw earlier that seemed to be tied to a skill, so perhaps you could either get this thermal vision from a scope or a skill. In this boost pack scene, it looks like we have the iconic AS Val equipped, and this appears to be a particle beam weapon based on the challenge completion, although it doesn't really look like a particle beam, at least not what my brain thinks a particle beam looks like. We get some more gameplay on Mars, back with this lever action launcher that is just epic. Let me know, thus far, what has been your favorite weapon from the Direct? And they reveal how firing a ballistic weapon in zero gravity will literally push you backwards. So sometimes in a zero grav environment, using something like a laser with no recoil may be better and have its own unique benefits then. We get some previews of mag weapons, which seem to be the new top tier option as far as weapons go, and the return of the weapon from earlier, and we discover this thing has 25 different slots for projectiles. I'm not even sure it's appropriate to refer to these as barrels anymore. Basically, the way it'll work is there's lasers attached to each and every barrel, and if it lines up and connects with an enemy, as you could see in the scope, that barrel will fire. This thing seems like it'll have absolutely insane DPS at close range, where basically every shot is almost guaranteed to hit. We see a cryo mine freeze a different faction's Model S, so it seems like robots will be used by all kinds of factions, just like past games. And here, we punch this Ecliptic in the face, and we get the big reveal, finally a lootable piece of clothing. It took this long into the Direct for one of these to pop up. One suspicion I have is perhaps in combat, if you damage an enemy's spacesuit with weapons, like you shoot through it, you cannot actually loot their outfit after because it was destroyed or ruined. But maybe here, since we punch them down, we are able to loot their helmet, although their actual spacesuit is still not lootable for some reason. On this shroom head grazer, we can see that big blue bar come back, and we actually reset it somewhat after our punch. It seems like this punch deals a ton of damage, busting through multiple of the health regens, so maybe this is Neuro Strike in action. You charge it up and deal one super powerful punch. We get a super quick shot of fighting a maggot maw with a literal minigun as we target an explosive tank to expedite the process, as well as this break action revolver has a really cool design as it shows which cylinders have been fired with each round being expended. As we take on this twist fin, our CO2 is red, almost like our stamina bar is shrunken here. I would guess this is due to some attacks this enemy landed on us, leading to us having reduced stamina temporarily, almost like we're poisoned. And here we could see some gameplay with just a good old-fashioned AK, which is really nice to see in Starfield. We don't have to wait for modders to add it in this time. In this sword shot, we get a look at a completely new brand of station with a Nova Galactic Star Yard. At least probably, as this name is slightly cut off. Nova Galactic is a company we have seen in some of the other gameplay, so it seems like this will be a Star Yard where a company will sell us ships. But it's nice to see some of the corporations also will have a presence in Starfield, and it's not all just government bodies and enemy factions. And here we get it, almost at the end of the Direct, a look at a lootable spacesuit, and this enemy too was finished off with a melee weapon. So perhaps there is some kind of spacesuit damage component, or maybe it's just you have to melee enemies down in order to actually loot their clothing or armor. A bunch of robots controlled by religious zealots chasing you down like this is literally something out of a horror movie, and probably my nightmares once I actually play Starfield. And during all of this, there is a bunch of general combat gameplay where there really isn't much to commentate on. But overall, I think this looks great. We get shots of third-person and first-person combat, which I am very happy about. And honestly, compared to the 2022 gameplay, the combat here looks miles better and just genuinely fun. The weapons also seem incredibly diverse, with a mix of old world and spacer tech, but also just some fun and bizarre science weapons scattered throughout. Then we finally get to see the magic. In this scene, we can see our character using some kind of ability to manipulate gravity and suspend the enemies in thin air. They even appear to put their weapons away here and get slightly pushed back. It seems like this is going to be connected to us finding the relic, and many people speculate that secret 6th menu option will be connected to all of this. But yeah, Starfield has some kind of magic or force-like ability in it, although basically nothing is known about how this will function beyond this short clip. To end off the Direct, we see a variety of beauty shots of Starfield, showcasing some of the devs' favorite moments. This purple planet just looks epic, perhaps the unique coloring is tied to some of the unique atmospheric traits, but then there's also a look at the Constellation Star Station LO868, which is going to be the star station we see in that original Starfield reveal trailer. We finally get a proper look at photo mode. It appears to be very similar to Fallout 76's photo mode with with options to toggle your helmet on or off. You can toggle the player on or off, and there are even some different poses like jumping among a variety of other poses we see in the actual photos. Photo mode is such a powerful tool for content generation. I'm excited to see, with the vast array of planets in Starfield, what kind of cool content is made as a result of this. We attach an engine to our ship here and discover some new information. No more specific weapon types are listed in the power breakdown. Instead, we just have weapon 0 and weapon 1, instead of it being lasers, ballistic, or even missiles. As well as the engine itself affects a few things. Thrust, but separately thrust while maneuvering, which is interesting. And it also increases our crew capacity by 0.25, which honestly just seems funny and odd. Because on one hand, if an engine is going to affect crew capacity, why is it such a small amount? We can only fit 0.25 more of a human due to this engine. We see some truly low gravity gameplay as the player jumps into this rather large tower all the way from the ground. And one of the funniest parts of the direct for me is this beach. We see some people just hanging out at the beach on lounge chairs, at least kind of on lounge chairs, and there's a fish bowl next to them with a fish inside of it. This guy really brought his fish to the beach today. And then for me, what is genuinely one of the most curious shots from the entirety of the direct, we see an alien standing on a rock, and it almost looks like it's bipedal. It has some human elements. If anything, this almost gives me human-alien hybrid vibes. During the shot, the voiceover says that you can do what you want to do. So perhaps this is a romance partner? When in reality, this is likely connected to some kind of first contact moment in Starfield or another major story moment. And in this final montage, we could see our watch actually can poke through some of the spacesuits, which is just an awesome little detail. And the literal final shot, it looks like we have Vasco and a second companion exploring with us at the same time, which is great. We don't have to wait for mods to add in that functionality either. But with that is the Starfield Direct breakdown. Hopefully you guys found this video informative or interesting. If you actually watched all 2 hours or so of this thing, thank you. But maybe check out this video with Todd Howard, where he shares a bunch of additional information about Starfield.